the deadliest cowboy in Wyoming, reached for his gun the exact moment a crying baby grabbed his finger instead. Snow slammed against the burning barn roof as Colt Mercer ran through the smoke, with the baby pressed under his coat and Savannah stumbling beside him. Somewhere behind them, a horse screamed and timber cracked loud enough to shake the ground. Then Colt looked down at the child in his arms and froze for half a second like he'd just remembered something he lost a long time ago. Stay with me until the end. This story goes somewhere your heart won't expect. The first snow of November had not yet settled on the mountains when Colt Mercer rode into Red Hollow. Cold wind moved through the valley in long, restless breaths, carrying the smell of pine smoke, wet horses, and coal from the railroad line east of town. Wagon wheels dragged through muddy ruts. Somewhere near the stock pens, cattle bawled against the coming storm. People noticed him immediately. They always did. A boy carrying feed sacks near the general store stopped walking altogether. Two men outside the barber shop lowered their voices. Even the piano inside the Meridian Sassoon seemed to stumble for half a note when Colt tied his gray gelding to the rail out front. "The Wolf of Wyoming," somebody muttered from the boardwalk. Colt ignored it. He wore a dark wool coat dusted with trail snow, a weathered hat pulled low, and a revolver tied low against his right thigh. Not flashy, nothing polished about him, but there was a steadiness in the way he moved that made people step aside without being asked. He walked into the saloon with the wind still following behind him. The Meridian smelled like whiskey, lamp oil, and damp leather. A poker game had stalled near the back wall. Cowboys sat hunched over coffee cups instead of liquor. Winter was coming hard this year, and men felt it in their bones. Gus Harper stood behind the bar drying glasses, with a gray towel that had probably started clean sometime in October. "You look like weather," Gus said carefully. "Been called worse." Gus poured coffee instead of whiskey without asking. Colt appreciated that more than he showed. "You huntin' somebody this time?" Gus asked. Colt wrapped his hands around the tin cup. "Maybe." That answer traveled through the room faster than smoke. Because men knew what it meant when Colt Mercer said maybe. It meant somebody was already in trouble. Outside, the wind rattled the saloon windows. Snow threatened in the clouds over the mountains west of town. Colt drank half the coffee and watched the room through the mirror behind the bar. A cattle broker near the stairs. Two railroad men arguing quietly. A ranch hand asleep at a corner table. Nobody looked like Amos Whitaker's men. Not yet. Then the side door opened. Cold air swept inside first. After it came a woman carrying a baby wrapped in a faded green blanket. Conversation lowered without fully stopping. Heads turned the way they always did when somebody unfamiliar walked into a western town carrying hardship on their shoulders. She was tall for a woman, though thin from too many difficult months. Dark brown skin. Heavy wool coat, patched carefully at one elbow. Her hair was pinned back beneath a scarf, though loose curls had escaped around her face from the wind. Tired eyes, not weak ones. She paused just inside the doorway, adjusting the baby against her shoulder while taking in the room in a single quiet sweep. Colt noticed that. People who survived hard places learned to study rooms before stepping into them. She crossed toward the bar, while the piano started up again softly in the corner. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. Her voice was calm, southern, gentle without sounding helpless. Gus nodded. "That's me. I was told a man named Walter Pike might still be hiring seamstresses for winter work." Gus shifted uncomfortably. "Pike headed north yesterday." Something passed across her face, then disappeared before it fully formed. Not disappointment exactly. More like exhaustion that already expected disappointment before arriving. "I see," she said softly. The baby stirred against her shoulder. She bounced him once automatically, her hand moving with the ease of long practice. Then she noticed the small writing table near the window. Ink bottle, lamp, a few old newspapers. Her eyes moved around the room again, past the ranchers, past the railroad men, past the drunks, until they stopped on Colt Mercer's. For a second, neither of them spoke. Colt had stared down armed men across poker tables without blinking, had tracked killers through blizzards in Montana territory, had once spent 3 days riding with a bullet still lodged near his ribs, because stopping meant dying. But there was something unsettling about the directness of her gaze. Not fear, not admiration, just assessment. Like she was deciding whether the world would allow her one small favor tonight. She walked toward him. Several men openly watched now. "Sir," she said, "I know this is an unusual request." Colt waited. "I need to write a letter before the post closes." She shifted the baby slightly higher. "Would you hold him for 1 minute while I write it?" The room went still. One cowboy near the stove actually coughed into his whiskey, trying not to laugh. Because nobody in Red Hollow would ask Colt Mercer to hold a baby. Nobody except this woman, apparently. Colt looked down at the child bundled in green cloth. Wide, dark eyes looked back at him. Serious eyes, quiet eyes he should have refused. Instead, he heard himself say, "1 minute." She stepped closer and carefully placed the baby in his arms. The weight surprised him. Small, warm, alive. Colt held him awkwardly at first, one large scarred hand supporting the child beneath the blanket. The baby blinked once, studying his face with complete concentration. No crying, no fussing, just calm. The woman moved to the writing table and opened a worn leather satchel. Colt could hear the scratch of her pen against paper, while the saloon watched him like they'd all just witnessed a mountain lion sit down at Sunday church. Then something tiny wrapped around his finger. Colt looked down. The baby had grabbed his hand, a full fist around one finger, strong grip too. The child stared at him with solemn curiosity while Colt stood frozen beside the bar, afraid to move too suddenly. Gus Harper slowly lowered the glass he'd been polishing. Nobody spoke. The piano player stopped entirely this time. And in the strange quiet of the Meridian Saloon, the fiercest cowboy in Wyoming stood holding a 5-month-old baby like it was the most fragile thing he had ever touched. The woman looked back once from the writing table. She saw the baby gripping Colt's finger, saw the way the big cowboy hadn't pulled away. Something softened in her eyes for just a second before she returned to writing. Outside, snow finally began to fall over Red Hollow. The flakes drifted past the saloon windows in slow white spirals, settling over wagon tracks and hitching rails and the roofs along Main Street. The whole town seemed quieter once the snow started, as if winter itself expected people to lower their voices. Colt still stood at the bar with the baby in his arms. The child had not let go of his finger. "What's his name?" Colt asked, finally. The woman looked up from the table. "Elijah." The baby blinked at the sound of his name but stayed calm against Colt's chest. "He ain't scared of you," Gus Harper muttered under his breath. Colt gave him a look. Gus wisely found another glass to clean. The woman folded her letter carefully and slid it into an envelope already softened at the corners from travel. Then she stood and crossed the room toward Colt again. Up close, he noticed small details he had missed before. The faint dark circles beneath her eyes, a burn mark near the cuff of her glove, the careful stitching along the collar of her coat where she had repaired it herself. She took Elijah gently back into her arms. The baby made a small, unhappy sound at leaving Colt's shoulder. That surprised all three of them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You found work?" "No." She adjusted the blanket around Elijah. "But I found out where not to look anymore." There was no bitterness in the words, just tired acceptance. Colt nodded once. "What's your name?" he asked. "Savannah Reed, Colt Mercer." A faint flicker crossed her face. Of course she knew the name. Everybody west of Cheyenne knew the name. But unlike most people, she didn't seem impressed by it, or frightened. She only studied him another second before saying, "Good night, Mr. Mercer." Then she walked out into the snow. Colt watched the saloon door close behind her. Something about the sight stayed with him longer than it should have. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. Straight-backed, even when tired. Maybe it was the child. Or maybe it was because she had looked at him like a man instead of a reputation. He finished his coffee and headed upstairs to his room at the Royal Crest Hotel just before midnight. The room smelled faintly of coal dust and old wallpaper paste. Narrow iron bed, wash basin, frost beginning to gather at the corners of the window. Colt removed his gun belt and sat on the edge of the mattress. Usually, after riding into a new town, his thoughts stayed practical. Names, trails, men to question, places to search. Tonight, his mind kept drifting back to a pair of tired brown eyes and the warm weight of a child holding his finger. That irritated him more than he cared to admit. The next morning arrived hard and gray. Wind pushed snow along the boardwalks while ranch hands hurried cattle through the stockyard before the storm deepened. Colt spent most of the morning near the rail depot asking questions about Whitaker's freight shipments. Too many cattle moved through Red Hollow without proper branding papers. Too many ranchers had suddenly sold land cheap after mysterious fires, and every trail eventually curved back toward Amos Whitaker. By noon, Colt had gathered enough to know his instincts were right, but something else caught his attention first. Across the muddy stockyard road, Savannah Reed stood beside a fence, speaking to a trail boss wrapped in buffalo wool. Elijah rested against her chest inside a sling beneath her coat. The trail boss shook his head before she even finished speaking. Savannah thanked him politely anyway. Then she moved on to the next man and the next. Each conversation ended the same way. Colt watched her pull a small leather sample from her satchel. Hand stitching, reinforced edges, clean work. Nobody looked twice at it. One ranch hand laughed quietly after she walked away. Colt's jaw tightened before he realized it had. He crossed the road. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Savannah noticed him coming but didn't step back. "Morning," she said. "Morning." A gust of wind swept through the yard, rattling loose tin against the stable roof nearby. "You looking for tack work?" Colt asked. "Yes. You know saddle stitching? I know how to rebuild a trail saddle that's been abused for 600 miles. There wasn't a trace of bragging in her voice, just fact. Colt held out his hand. "Let me see." She passed him the leather sample. Good stitching, tight and even. Strong enough for winter cattle drives, better than half the repair work he'd seen from hired saddlemen. "You do this yourself?" "My father taught me." Colt handed it back. "There's a trail outfit camped north of the rail line. Foreman's name is Wade Bennett. Cheap man, but he respects good work." Savannah hesitated slightly. "Why are you helping me?" Simple question, no softness around it. Colt looked past her toward the snowy stock pens. "Maybe I don't like watching capable people get ignored." That almost smile touched her mouth for half a second. "You always this charitable." "No." "Then I suppose I should appreciate the rare occasion." For the first time in years, Colt nearly smiled back before catching himself. Elijah stirred sleepily against her chest. Tiny mitten pressed against her coat. Savannah adjusted the blanket around him with one careful hand. The movement was automatic, protective without drawing attention to itself. Colt found himself watching it longer than necessary. "You staying at Clara Mayfield's boarding house?" he asked. "Yes. She'll keep your room if she likes you, and if she doesn't, she'll throw your trunk into the street before breakfast." That earned a quiet laugh from Savannah. Warm sound, unexpected. The wind carried it away almost immediately across the stockyard. But Colt heard it, and somehow the entire frozen morning felt less cold afterward. By late afternoon, the storm had settled fully over Red Hollow. Snow drifted against the boardwalks in crooked white piles while lanterns flickered on one by one along Main Street. Horses stood steaming outside the feed store. Somewhere farther down the road, a blacksmith hammered iron in slow, measured strikes that echoed through the valley. Colt found Wade Bennett's trail outfit camped north of the rail line, exactly where he expected. Canvas bedrolls, chuck wagon smoke, 30 head of restless cattle crowded against the fencing, while men cursed the weather and tightened frozen saddle straps. Wade Bennett stood near the fire drinking coffee from a dented tin cup. "You bring trouble or work?" Bennett asked as Colt approached. "Depends how bad your tack is," Bennett snorted. "Bad enough I had a stirrup leather snap near Casper." Colt nodded toward town. Woman named Savannah Reed does repair work. A woman. She's better than half the saddlemen in Wyoming. That got Bennett's attention. An hour later, Savannah arrived, carrying Elijah, wrapped tightly beneath a thick wool blanket. Snow dusted her shoulders, silver beneath the lantern light. The camp quieted a little, watching her walk in. Not hostile, just curious. Colt noticed she kept her chin level anyway. Bennett handed her a cracked saddle rig without much ceremony. Fix that by morning, and I'll hand you the rest. Savannah examined the leather carefully near the firelight, fingers moving over the damaged stitching with quick confidence. You kept riding after this split? Had cattle to move. You also had good luck. Bennett barked out a laugh at that. For the next hour, she worked near the chuck wagon, while snow hissed softly against the canvas covers overhead. Colt stayed longer than necessary under the excuse of checking freight manifests with Bennett. Truth was, he kept watching her hands. Steady hands. Precise. Every tool in her sewing roll had its place. All wax thread, needles wrapped in cloth, small scissors sharpened recently. Elijah slept in a basket beside her chair near the fire. Once the baby stirred and fussed softly. Savannah reached down automatically without stopping her stitching. Before she could settle him, Colt crouched beside the basket. Elijah opened sleepy eyes, recognized him immediately, then calmed. Savannah looked up from her work. You seem to have been accepted, she said quietly. By him, maybe. He's particular. Colt glanced down at the child. You saying I should feel honored? I'm saying he usually cries at strangers. The corner of Colt's mouth almost moved again. Almost. A burst of laughter rose from farther across camp where cowboys played cards beneath a lantern. Wind pushed smoke sideways through the corrals. Savannah stitched another section carefully before speaking again. You always help people this much? No. Then maybe I caught you in a charitable week. Don't count on a second one this time. She smiled openly, not big, just enough to change her whole face. Colt looked away first. That annoyed him too. By the time she finished the repair, snow had buried most of the wagon tracks outside camp. Bennett inspected the saddle under lantern light and grunted approvingly. You saved me $30 and probably a broken neck. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her folded bills. Bring her back tomorrow, Mercer. I got more. Savannah stared briefly at the money before carefully tucking it into her satchel. Not relief exactly, but close. Colt walked with her toward town afterward, through the falling snow. Their boots crunched softly, side by side. The whole street looked washed pale beneath winter moonlight. At Clara Mayfield's boarding house, yellow lamplight glowed through frost-covered windows. Someone inside was playing a hymn softly on an upright piano missing half its polish. Savannah stopped near the front steps. Thank you, she said. For what? For seeing me before deciding what I was. Colt went still a moment. Wind rattled the sign above the porch. I didn't do much. You did enough. Elijah shifted sleepily against her shoulder. Tiny hand curled against her scarf. Savannah adjusted the blanket around him before looking back at Colt again. You know, she said softly, most men in that saloon last night looked at you like they expected you to break something. And you didn't. No. Why not? She thought about that longer than he expected. Because you held him carefully. Simple answer. Nothing dramatic in it. But something about hearing it tightened quietly inside Colt's chest. Before he could respond, the boarding house door opened. Clara Mayfield stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a thick knitted shawl. There you are, she said to Savannah. I was about to send half the town searching. Then she noticed Colt standing there beneath the snow. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. Well, she said slowly, this is unexpected. Savannah hid a tired smile. Mr. Mercer helped me find work. Did he now? Clara looked Colt over carefully the way older women sometimes did when deciding whether a man deserved politeness. Apparently, he passed enough inspection. You both better get inside before you freeze solid, Clara said. Savannah climbed the porch steps, then paused near the doorway. Good night, Mr. Mercer. Night, Miss Reed. She disappeared inside with Elijah. Warm light spilled briefly across the snow before the door closed again. Colt stood there, another few seconds listening to the muffled sound of Clara, fussing over whether Savannah had eaten supper yet. Then he turned back toward town. Halfway down the street, he noticed movement near the livery stable across from Whitaker's freight office. Two men loading unmarked crates onto a wagon despite the storm. Moving fast, trying not to be noticed. Colt stepped into the shadow beside the barber shop awning and watched. One crate cracked briefly against the wagon rail. Inside, beneath straw packing, Colt caught the unmistakable glint of fresh branding irons. New ones, unregistered. A bad feeling settled low in his stomach. Then one of the men mentioned Whitaker's name, and Colt realized Red Hollow was dirtier than he first thought. The wagon rolled away toward the north end of town, wheels crunching slowly through fresh snow. Colt stayed beneath the awning another minute, watching the lantern light disappear into the storm. Branding irons shipped at night meant stolen cattle. Fresh brands turned somebody else's herd into legal property by sunrise. It was an old trick. Effective, too, if the sheriff looked the other way. Colt pulled his coat tighter against the wind and crossed the street toward the sheriff's office. Light glowed beneath the door. Inside, Sheriff Boone Carter sat with his boots propped on a desk, cluttered with unpaid invoices, tobacco ash, and two cold biscuits wrapped in paper. The office smelled like damp wool and stale coffee. Boone looked up slowly when Colt entered. "I heard you were in town," he said. "You heard right." Boone lowered his boots with obvious reluctance. "What do you want?" Whitaker moving cattle after dark now. The sheriff's face changed too quickly. Small thing. But Colt noticed. "You got proof of something?" Boone asked. "I got eyes. That enough these days?" "For me, usually." Boone sighed heavily and rubbed at the gray stubble along his jaw. He looked like a tired man trying to stay comfortable inside bad decisions. "Whitaker owns half this town," Boone muttered. "Rail contracts, feed supply, winter freight. That's supposed to impress me?" "No." Boone held his gaze. "It's supposed to warn you." Silence settled between them. Wind rattled the office windows hard enough to shake loose snow from the roof outside. Finally, Boone leaned forward slightly. "Whatever you think you're chasing here," he said quietly, "let it stay buried." Colt stared at him a long moment. Then he turned and walked out without another word. By the following afternoon, the storm had deepened. Red Hollow disappeared beneath gray skies and blowing snow. Most folks stayed indoors unless work dragged them outside. The boardwalks were nearly empty, except for freight hands and ranch boys running errands with scarves wrapped over their faces. Colt spent the morning checking shipment ledgers at the rail depot. 3 ranches listed cattle losses during the last 6 months. All 3 later sold land cheap to Amos Whitaker. Too convenient. Around noon, he folded the papers closed and headed back toward town when he spotted Savannah outside Miller's Leather Goods near the stock pens. She stood beneath the overhang, brushing snow from her sleeves, while Elijah slept against her chest, bundled in layers of wool. A broken saddle rested beside her feet. "You get the job?" Colt asked as he approached. Savannah looked up. "I got 4. There was quiet pride in her voice now, not much, just enough. Colt glanced toward the saddle. "Bennett spread word already?" He said. "I saved him from freezing to death somewhere near Sheridan." "Sounds like Bennett." That almost smile appeared again. Savannah nudged the saddle lightly with her boot. "This one belongs to a rancher south of town. Rear cinch tore clean off. You can fix it?" "I can fix most things if people stop damaging them faster than I sew." Colt huffed a short laugh before he could stop himself. That seemed to surprise both of them equally. A freight wagon rolled past nearby, iron wheels scraping frozen mud. Snow swirled behind it. Savannah shifted Elijah higher beneath the blanket. The baby stirred awake slowly, blinking at the white sky. Then he noticed Colt. Tiny Mitten immediately reached outward. Colt stared at him. Savannah noticed that too. "He remembers you," she said, softly. "That seems unlikely." "You underestimate yourself, Mr. Mercer." Nobody had said something that gentle to him in a very long time. He cleared his throat slightly. You eaten yet? She hesitated. Small pause. Enough answer by itself. There's stew at Clara's boarding house, Colt said. Probably terrible, but hot. That your way of inviting someone to lunch? It's my way of preventing starvation during winter. Savannah laughed quietly under her breath and adjusted Elijah's blanket again. They walked back through town together, carrying the saddle between them. People noticed. Of course they did. Old men near the feed store stopped talking when Colt passed. A woman outside the mercantile watched from behind frost-covered glass. Two ranch hands near the saloon exchanged looks. Red Hollow was the kind of town that survived winters by knowing everybody else's business. Inside Clara Mayfield's boarding house, warmth hit immediately. Wood smoke, onions cooking, fresh bread. Clara stood near the stove, stirring a pot while arguing with someone upstairs about muddy boots. Well, she announced when she saw Colt. Either hell froze over or you finally learned manners. Afternoon to you too, Clara. Savannah tried not to smile. Clara noticed that immediately. Older women missed very little. They ate at a small corner table near the window, while snow covered Main Street outside. Clara served thick beef stew in chipped bowls alongside biscuits brushed with butter. Elijah slept in a basket beside the stove wrapped in quilts Clara claimed were older than Wyoming territory itself. For a while, nobody spoke much. Just the sound of spoons against bowls and wind scratching at the windows. Then Savannah noticed Colt studying a tear along his coat sleeve near the shoulder. You ripped that recently. Fence wire. You sew? No, that's obvious. She reached into her satchel and removed a small sewing kit wrapped in cloth. Colt watched quietly while she threaded a needle beside the lamp. Her hands moved quickly, confidently. Outside, snow continued falling over Red Hollow. Inside, the room felt strangely still, like the storm had paused somewhere beyond the windows and forgotten to come inside. Savannah sat near the lamp with Colt's coat spread across her lap while Elijah slept beside the stove, one tiny fist resting against his cheek. The baby made soft breathing sounds now and then beneath Clara's quilts. Colt watched Savannah mend the torn sleeve with small, careful stitches. You do that fast, he said. I've had practice. You always worked leather. My father repaired harnesses outside Vicksburg. She trimmed the thread with a small pair of scissors. By the time I was 10, he had me sewing saddle blankets. You miss Mississippi? Savannah smiled faintly without looking up. I miss people who were there. That answer settled quietly between them. Clara crossed the dining room carrying fresh coffee. She poured Colt another cup before setting one beside Savannah too. You'll stay for pie, Clara announced. That sounds less like an offer, Colt said. At my age, everything becomes an instruction. Savannah laughed softly again. Clara noticed the sound and hid a satisfied expression before returning to the kitchen. For a while only, the ticking wall clock filled the room. Snow kept falling outside, heavy now, the kind that buried fences overnight. Savannah finished the stitching and handed the coat back. There, she said, should hold through winter unless you insist on wrestling barbed wire again. Colt ran his thumb over the repaired seam. Strong work, better than before it tore. How much do I owe you? You already paid me. When? You found me work. He started to argue, stopped, because she was serious. That happened less and less around him lately. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Savannah Reed seemed interested only in fairness. Colt folded the coat over his arm. Storm's getting worse, Clara called from the kitchen. Road north'll be closed by morning. Good thing I'm not headed north, Colt answered. But his thoughts already were. Back to Whitaker, back to the freight crates. Back to Sheriff Boone Carter looking nervous in that office. He stood to leave. Elijah woke just then with a small, restless sound. Savannah reached for him, automatically, but the baby turned instead toward Colt's voice. Tiny arms moved beneath the blanket. Colt froze awkwardly beside the table. Savannah looked down at Elijah, then back up at Colt. He likes you, she said quietly. Seems he's got questionable judgment. No, she said. I don't think he does. The room went still again after that. Not uncomfortable, just full somehow. Clara suddenly appeared carrying a slice of apple pie large enough to feed 3 ranch hands. "You'll sit back down," she informed Colt, "or I'll take personal offense." Colt slowly sat again. Savannah hid another smile behind her coffee cup. Outside, wind drove snow against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. An hour later, the boarding house had mostly gone quiet. Upstairs, floorboards creaked occasionally. Pipes knocked softly in the walls. Clara finished extinguishing lamps one by one near the hallway. Colt finally stood near the front door pulling on his gloves. Savannah walked him to the porch, while Elijah slept against her shoulder. The storm had swallowed most of Main Street already. Only a few lanterns remained visible through the blowing white dark. "You should stay careful," Savannah said softly. Colt glanced at her. "That concern for everybody?" "No." Honest answer. Simple as that. Wind lifted loose curls across her face. She tucked them back beneath her scarf with cold fingers. "I heard people talking today," she continued. "About Whitaker." "What people?" "Men who stop talking when someone enters the room usually say enough beforehand." Colt leaned one shoulder against the porch post. "And what they say?" "That folks who cross Amos Whitaker tend to leave town." She paused. "If they're lucky." Snow drifted across the porch steps between them. Colt studied her quietly. Most people warned him because they feared violence. Savannah sounded different, like she feared losing something before she'd even decided whether she was allowed to keep it. "I've handled worse men than Whitaker," Colt said. "That's what worries me." The words caught him slightly off guard, because she wasn't impressed by danger. She was tired of it. A lantern swung gently above the porch in the wind. Down the street, a freight train whistle echoed through the valley, long and lonely. Savannah shifted Elijah higher against her shoulder. The baby never fully woke. "You should get inside," Colt said finally. "Cold's turning sharper. So are you." He frowned slightly. "You get quieter every time Whitaker's name comes up." Colt looked out toward the buried street. "I'm working something. I know." "You know? You watch windows instead of people when you're thinking." She gave the faintest shrug. Men expecting trouble usually do. Nobody had observed him that carefully in years, maybe ever. He looked back at her then. Really looked. Snowflakes melting slowly in the dark curls near her temple. The tiredness beneath her eyes. The steadiness she carried anyway. For one dangerous second, Colt had the strange feeling that if he stayed on this porch too long, he might tell her things he normally buried deep enough nobody could reach them. So he stepped backward into the snow instead. "Good night, Miss Reed." Savannah's eyes stayed on him another moment. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." Colt walked into the storm with snow gathering on his shoulders and the warmth of the boarding house fading behind him. Halfway down Main Street, he stopped. Across from Whitaker's freight office stood a rider beside the hitching rail. Deputy Eli Grayson. Young, nervous, snow covering his hat brim. "You been looking for me?" Colt asked. Eli nodded once. "There was another ranch fire last month south of Bitter Creek," he said quietly. "Family lost everything. And," Eli swallowed hard, "they sold the land to Whitaker 3 days later." The wind howled down the empty street. Then Eli reached into his coat pocket and handed Colt a folded paper. A freight receipt, signed with the name Daniel Reed, Savannah's dead husband. By the time the winter finally loosened its grip on Red Hollow, the snow around the old boarding house had begun to melt into long silver streams beneath the morning sun. Horses moved slower in the mud. The train whistles sounded softer somehow. And inside that little cabin on the south end of town, a lamp still burned every evening beside the window. Maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not the gunfight, not the storm, not even the fear. Maybe it's the thought of coming home after years of carrying the whole world alone, and finding someone waiting there with warm coffee, tired eyes, and enough trust left to hand you the most important thing in their life. If you've ever spent years pretending you didn't need anybody, if you've ever buried grief so deep you thought it would stay there forever, then you probably understand Colt Mercer better than he ever understood himself. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting. Sometimes it's staying. Staying long enough to let people love you. Staying long enough to build something gentle with the same hands that once only knew survival. And maybe that's what family really is in the end. Not perfection. Not blood. Just people choosing each other over and over again when the world gets cold. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you felt it most down in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a little longer here with us. There are still more quiet western roads ahead, more forgotten towns, wounded hearts, impossible chances, and the kind of stories that remind us why people keep believing in each other at all.